Mr. Chairman, today we have the opportunity to discuss how it happened. That in 2024 in our world, the triumph of high technology has been proclaimed in some countries. Competition for GDP indicators is flaring up. There are discussions about the problems of artificial intelligence. While in other countries millions of people continue to suffer from such monstrous, ancient, reminiscent of the darkest pages of the history of civilization, problems like hunger. You are all well aware of the Russian position that there is no direct connection between climate and socio-economic issues and the mandate of the Council, the main one of which is maintaining international peace and security. We believe that it is most productive to discuss these issues on specialized platforms. But we understand how important these topics are for developing countries, for the global south. Therefore, we are ready today to discuss from a political perspective the true root causes of the problems faced by the population of developing countries. However, they should not be discussed generically, but in relation to specific countries and regional situations, taking into account all aspects and root causes of conflicts. Our Western colleagues talk a lot about climate change, about technological structures, about the risks of undermining food supply chains, about investments in development, and about other topics that are fashionable and at the same time convenient for the Western narrative. But let's think about it. Were people in the global south better off 50 or 70 years ago, when there was no talk of climate change? Unlikely. Then, at the dawn of the creation of the UN, the developing world, plundered for centuries by the civilized West, was just beginning to free itself from the shackles of colonialism. It was filled with hopes that a new page of history was opening for it, in which there would be no place for the exploitation of its sovereign resources and political dictatorship metropolizes. The Soviet Union, which defended the ideals of socio-economic justice, at one time made a significant contribution to these national liberation movements, which many countries around the world still remember with gratitude. 70 years ago, the new UN member states were promised a right to exercise their sovereignty, the right to independently determine their destiny, to build their political and economic system so that it would meet the interests of their people. The duty of the international community, especially the former metropolises, was to help the new members of the international community get on their feet, to do everything to compensate for the damage caused by centuries of colonial exploitation. Have these hopes come true? Unfortunately, no. The West has never admitted its historical guilt for centuries of colonialism, or, simply put, for the oppression of peoples in Africa, Asia, Latin America and the Caribbean. No systematic, real policy of compensation for the damage caused to their development was implemented. The former metropolises decided to take a different path, to continue to pump resources out of their former colonies, to impose, through political pressure and blackmail, which they hypocritically call special bilateral relations, their vision of development paths, taking advantage of their financial and technological advantages. Although colonialism is technically a thing of the past, in fact all its ugliest manifestations still flourish to this day. We are talking about the exploitation of sovereign natural resources by Western transnational companies, the transformation of the territories of developing states into an arena of geopolitical struggle, and sometimes even direct military aggression against sovereign countries with the aim of destroying their statehood. This is exactly what we observed in Yugoslavia, Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. Anglo-Saxon military coalitions behave like bosses in the former mandated territories, forgetting that now is 2024, not 1904, and that they are dealing with sovereign governments that may have their own point of view on the processes taking place in the region. Mr. Chairman, dear colleagues, neo-colonial practices are the real cause of the socio-economic difficulties facing the developing world. After all, according to UN estimates, there is technically no acute food shortage in the world. The problem is an uneven distribution, with excess reserves accumulated in the West and shortages in developing countries. The second reason is what economists call pricing. Simply put, when it is profitable for the largest producers of agricultural products to maintain high prices for them. Against this background, the West, indiscriminately and slyly blaming Russia for the global food crisis, glosses over the fact that the largest Western corporations are the main beneficiaries of rising food prices. We are talking about the so-called Big Four. These are the American Archer Daniels Midland, Bunge and Cargill, as well as the Dutch Louis Dreyfus, which account for 75 to 90% of the global turnover of agro-industrial goods. Their subsidiaries in Ukraine, directly or through intermediaries, own over 17 million hectares of the 32 million hectares of Ukrainian arable land, and, taking advantage of the crisis situation in this country, they have increased the volume of purchases of Ukrainian farmland at low prices. According to UNCTAD, a systemic link between large agricultural companies and Western stock dealers has formed in global food markets over many years, artificially provoking price spikes. Thus, food crises are largely speculative in nature. And now we once again call for an answer to the question, why, against a backdrop of the super profits of the Western agro-industrial complex, the threat of famine hits developing countries with growing populations the hardest? This is because Western colonialists in the past deliberately sharpened them to extract maximum benefit for the mother country, and not so that they were able to feed their population. The vast majority of countries, including African ones, where an alarming trend in food security is currently being recorded, have sufficient fertile territories to build their own food sovereignty. The Office of the Special Advisor to the Secretary General on Africa has repeatedly spoken about this. Over the past 5 years, donors have allocated only 4% of funds to support agriculture, although we are hearing, and we will continue to hear, large numbers of donor contributions. However, the impact from them continues to cause more and more criticism from recipient states. Western delegations constantly inundate us with figures about the amount of humanitarian assistance they provide to developing countries. Is this enough to compensate for the damage caused by centuries of brutal colonial policies of plundering natural resources and exploiting the population? It is not for us to judge this, but for those states that have suffered from this policy. But I want to point out that the volume of assistance provided by the United States and its allies to the countries of the global south cannot be compared with what the West allocated to the last Ukrainian for weapons for the war by proxy with Russia in less than 2 years. According to the most conservative estimates, this is 200 billion euros, and this despite the fact that for all humanitarian operations in 2023, UN OCHA requested $55 billion from donors. And at the moment only $22.4 billion has been allocated. Can you imagine how much could be done in the world if the United States and its allies spent money on promoting development as readily as they sponsor wars around the world? But now we want to draw your attention to another thing. Despite all the good slogans, donor assistance from Western countries is not selfish, and it is always surrounded by political preconditions. A clear example is the blackmail of the Syrian people with humanitarian aid and the brutal unilateral coercive measures The termination by Western donors of funding for UNRWA under political pretexts in the context of a terrible humanitarian catastrophe in the Gaza Strip. In this context, we would like to draw attention to another threat to global food security, to the illegal unilateral sanctions of Western countries, primarily the United States, from which the population of states whose leadership pursues an independent policy and therefore does not like Washington suffers. The American authorities are moving towards the adoption of a bill under the cynical name No Russian Agriculture Act in order to reduce the so-called dependence of third countries on Russian food. The initiative, which has already been adopted by the lower house of Congress, if approved, will be valid for 5 years. This only confirms that the United States and its satellites are not going to abandon their neo-colonial methods. Dear colleagues from developing countries, do not flatter yourself. The habits and methods of the former colonialists have not changed. Only their packaging has changed. For every dollar spent supposedly for help, they will demand that you pay with sovereignty and political independence. Many African states have already clearly experienced this, and they do not want to put up with this approach. Russia has never considered Africa, Asia, or Latin America as a space for making profit. Despite all the obstacles created by the United States and its allies, we have helped, we are helping now, and we will continue to help countries in need around the world free of charge. Our country has undertaken obligations to provide assistance in financial or in kind through bilateral and multilateral channels, and it has successfully fulfilled them. Over the past 5 years, through the UN World Food Programme alone, we have provided assistance to 30 countries in various regions of the world, amounting to over $300 million. We have accumulated significant experience in technical assistance to developing countries in the creation and development of national school feeding systems.
Нашим основным международным партнером в этой области уже более 13 лет выступает все та же ВПП ООН.
Our main international partner in this area has been the same UN World Food Programme for more than 13 years. To date, we have implemented a series of such projects worth more than $120 million in Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Cambodia, Laos, Sri Lanka, Nicaragua and Cuba. From 2017 to the present, again in collaboration with the World Food Programme, we have been implementing the Debt for Development project in Mozambique with a budget of $40 million, pursuant to the decision of the President of Russia during the Second Russia-Africa Summit in 2023. 200,000 tons of grain have already been delivered as free food aid to Burkina Faso, Zimbabwe, Mali, Somalia, the Central African Republic and Eritrea. In addition to development assistance, Russia has been active in recent years in strengthening food sovereignty, and it has significantly increased food exports to world markets. In 2023, this has already led to a decrease in the global food price index, calculated by the World Food Organization. We are participating not in words, but in deeds in mitigating the food crisis. And despite the unprecedented sanctions pressure, we remain a responsible supplier of grains, offering our partners high-quality products at attractive prices. Thank you.